And to some extent, that's the case here. Well, here we are, our last day together before our examination. What I want to do is to finish discussing, explaining the chapter on information, and then at the end of that, to sort of go back to where we began and try to pull it together in a very quick and concise way so that we begin to get a sense of the wholeness of what we've discovered and discussed in 4 chapters, prior to taking our first examination. So that's what I want to do this morning. And then I want to spend as much time as you would like and we have available to deal with the issues relevant to what you want to know, reviewing, etc., for the examination. Cognizant of the concept of feedback, I'm recognizing the fact that my comments and my reflections on what you think, dealing with your uncertainties, dealing with where you think you are, can help you to have feedback to decide whether you are comfortable or you need to do more thinking or planning or whatever it might be for how you write about the material based upon what I ask you on Tuesday of next week. Is that right? Tuesday of next week is when we have the exam? I'd actually expected a little larger turnout today. Maybe the vultures are not here today. I call the vultures the people that only show up on the review day on the assumption that if they listen well, they can get everything they need in one day and they don't have to dig through this. Maybe they're over waiting for the tapes to be delivered in the library. I don't know. Well, we came down to the last part of the chapter, and we can make a transition to why we divide the chapters up as we do, going back and reflecting what we talked about earlier, and that is that in the study of communication, we have some big concepts that run throughout a lot of different contexts. One of those, obviously, is information. We have something broadly called information theory, and then information theory becomes interesting in a variety of contexts, because how people communicate in interpersonal contexts, relationship, negotiation, interviewing, can be areas of study then that even become relevant to where we go in the remaining chapters of the book. For instance, relationship development, social cognition, interpersonal communication. Interviewing is a part of organizational communication. We talked a little bit about organizational communication, looking at an organization as an information acquiring, information processing, and information outputting system as the basic model of what an organization is. We'll expand more on that in a subsequent chapter, but at least hopefully we've made some connections that give us a foundation going in that direction. And the third part of this is to look then at the mass-mediated communication. Typically we talk about mass-mediated as being the kind of communication where there is a distance between the person who creates what can be conceived of as a message and the person who, in another sense, seeks, consumes, receives, processes that message. And typically we also have some kind of technology that is involved in what's going on. Technology like print, technology like radio, technology like film, technology like the internet, technology like television, where we have a technical channel, and mass then being a relatively small and defined source disseminating information or making it available to a larger array of individuals. And we'll talk more about the nature of mass media and mass audience and massness when we get into that chapter. But at least I wanted to sort of preview again where we're going. Now, when we think about the study of mass media, one of the questions that we go back to that we raised earlier on is, are we more often wise to think of ourselves as creating information, entertainment, which is informative, and advertising, which is informative, for people that are more or less passive or more or less engaged? One of the arguments they're going to make later on is that we're often, I think, probably misled into thinking that everything that we put out somebody cares about, that we have to be very much concerned with what we're doing and why we're doing it, and do other people really want what we're doing? We know, for instance, that we do market analysis, we do analysis of news shows. Are we an informative news service and so forth? Are we providing information to individuals that they want? Now, That also lays the foundation for something that we can call policy. One of the reasons that we study theory and research is that it helps us to drive policy. There are two kinds of policies that are important to us in this regard. One is the sort of programming policy or editorial policy of our particular organization. For instance, are we going to be a sort of hard news organization, or are we going to be a sort of soft news organization? Are we going to be a organization where news is a very incidental part of what we do, or is news going to be essentially all of what we do? See, these become policy issues for us. It may even drive what we as an organization think of as solid news. What is a fact? When have we done enough research to know that we're telling people what we think to be the absolute truth? Do we allow talk show hosts on? A talk show host can be notoriously bad in manufacturing information. I don't want to call attention to people like Rush Limbaugh, but is Rush objective? You say Rush? I've never heard of Rush, right? Rush is right. Didn't you know that? Anyway, that's his slogan. And the slogan of the Rush heads, or whatever they used to be called, maybe they still are. Well, the other thing is, how much communication ought we to allow and or encourage within a society? And that brings us to a concept that you may have heard of before called information richness. A number of years ago, a fellow who is now, I guess, of sort of that icon status, a fellow by the name of Steve Chaffee, whose name is mentioned with a researcher on page 165, just within the last year or so, Steve passed away, a fellow who's still relatively young, but nevertheless very, very instrumental in understanding some of the key elements. Information richness refers to the sort of variable, and you remember a variable is a concept that varies, the variable of how many media outlets you as an individual have access to. The argument is that the more outlets that you have access to, the richer the information society is, or the richer the greater there is information richness. Information richness is equated to the number of outlets. Some of you remember in what became very laughable, the fellow that came to be called Baghdad Bob, who was sitting somewhere in Baghdad telling the people of Iraq that the 3rd Division was nowhere to be seen, despite the fact that he, I guess, could have seen it from his studio. Now, would you say with a guy like that and maybe one channel, mass media channel, Saddam's channel, that Iraq had information richness? Would it be a rich information society, or would it be an information poor society? Yeah.
It'd be a society almost absent of objectivity.
Well, objectivity may not have as much to do with it as simply, it would be absent of richness because the assumption is I may like lots of sources so that I can confirm the objectivity of the news independent of just having to take somebody's opinion of that. Meaning that if we have a lot of reporters, we'd like to believe that we have a lot more objectivity, a lot more factuality, because people that are notoriously bad in news gathering and interpretation, input, processing, and output, may not even survive in that market. Now, I don't know whether that model works that way or not. A number of years ago, the Shah of Iran pretty well controlled the media. And one of the ways in which people introduced into Iran the voice, comments, opinions of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who some of you may have heard of, very few of you I imagine ever would remember, was that people smuggled into the country audio tapes of his statements. It was interesting that nobody thought the audio tapes would be something that you ought to monitor as they came into the country, because one assumption was audio tapes are what people listen to music. So people were bringing audio tapes in of his comments because his comments were banned. And all of a sudden, people were beginning to make copies of audio tapes. That's pretty simple. Even I can do that. And the next thing is I'm making these copies and I'm giving them to friends who give them to friends who give them to friends. And we have the mass dissemination of Ayatollah Khomeini's comments through sharing of audio tapes, not dissimilar in some sense to the sharing that goes on the internet. The internet becomes an interesting kind of device because usually in the mass media we think of a single source controlling the dissemination of information for the most part. Now I can photocopy a copy of Newsweek and give it to my friends. I can hand them a copy of Newsweek. I can audio or videotape and I can share that with my friends. But I'm not as likely to do that as I am to pass things on to other individuals and or tell them, go to this link and you'll find out other information. So one of the arguments that we will make is that the internet has added information richness. We also know that the internet is much more difficult for somebody like the Shah of Iran or Saddam Hussein to control. Particularly that's going to be the case when we get increased amount of wireless transmission, because with wirelessness then boundaries and borders become less real and important. Yeah.
I was just going to say that all the two newspaper cities that have become one newspaper cities have decreased the richness.
That's exactly right. And many people see that as a policy failure, even to the extent that in some instances you still have two newspapers published essentially by the same organization. And that becomes another problem, because do you get a divergence of opinion? Do you get a divergence of, a variety of alternative views? If you go back to my argument that news is to some extent persuasive, if I have 3 or 4 versions of something, will those versions diverge, and maybe somewhere I can glean the information that I want? For instance, I get a chance to read about the state efforts to draw new electoral maps in Fayette County, and I get a chance to read about that in other outlets. And the newspapers out of Austin are dealing with this in a lot different ways than one can imagine. The Chronicle is, and then if you get out in West Texas, you're going to get completely different versions. In a sense, what's the truth, you see? Well, the argument is that in a democratic society, First Amendment, we believe that there ought to be a richness of the information environment, giving people not so much, and this is in my mind an important legal constitutional principle. Does our First Amendment guarantee you the right to communicate by sending something out, or does it assure the right of individuals to get information that they want? Most constitutional lawyers will say that the First Amendment richness increases the likelihood that the community will be able to get information that it wants by fostering freedom of expression. But it is driven by the citizens' right to know that is more important than the organization's right to disseminate. That becomes then a big issue policy when we allow increased mergers both within a medium, and I don't know now, maybe some of you do, what percentage of all radio market is owned by Clear Channel Radio? It's a very large percentage. They even go out and create their own media events and then report on them, which we might find as being relatively problematic if we're a sort of hard-nosed journalism kind of person. We also get the problem of cross-integration, where, for instance, a person like Rupert Murdoch can own television, can own radio, and also print outlets. And we might say that frustrates people to get different versions. But most of us say it's nice to be able to have cable or cable or satellite, because I've got a lot of stuff there which I can get if I want. Is our community information richer because we have an NPR station in town? I would argue that it is. Now, there are people that don't want NPR radio in town, but aren't we richer for having it? And the same thing is true. for people who are liberal, they say, well, I have to put up with Rush Limbaugh, but I then can also have NPR radio, and I'm more likely to find news that I think, and we go back to the notion that information is driven by the perceptions that we have of the informativeness of the messages that we get, that help me to understand what's going on. We eventually, in the chapter on media, get into the sovereign viewer, sovereign reader, sovereign televiewer, sovereign listener. The argument is that people dictate communication policy by being willing to want, use, process, and we get into a theory called uses and gratification. Well, based upon that, then, a lot of theories have developed to explain how the information through mass media comes to people and is utilized by people. Now, you may remember in one of the review questions focuses on the dominant mechanistic model that sort of says that information programming opinion in the media is like a magic bullet that comes banging into our heads, and the only thoughts we have are those that are put there by the mass media. You may remember also that I said just about the time that that theory was becoming dominant in the analysis of the role of mass media in society, a fellow by the name of Joseph Clapper, in a book published in 1960, argued that indeed we are selective viewers, we're selective readers, we selectively pay more attention to certain things than others, we selectively recall, we selectively interpret. Let's play that out just a little bit. If you and a good friend go to a lecture, that's a starting point in our discussion. Do all of you hear the same things? Do all of you remember the same things? No. Let's say you go to a movie. Let's say you watch television. Let's say that you're a real Democrat liberal, a Howard Dean Democrat, and you're watching an interview, and I've seen them several nights running on Fox, of the President of the United States, and you're sitting in a room with a real Bush diehard Republican. Do you hear the same stuff that they do? Do you interpret it the same way that they do? Are you more likely to say, if you don't like what he thinks and believes and says, that this is further evidence that he's a fool? Where your friend is sitting there saying this is further evidence that the man really is in charge and that we ought to give him all of our support. So you see what I'm getting at is that the reinforcement model, this reinforcement theory says that we first of all selectively expose ourselves to certain kind of information. We do that. There's another theory called involvement based upon what information we think most is likely to serve our self-interest. Now, there is a magazine out there called 17. I think there's also a magazine probably called Junior Miss. Except for maybe wanting to know what my granddaughter might someday be trying to find out about the world by reading those, why would I want to read those? Except maybe I'm a media scholar and I want to know what's in those. But is there anything that is discussed in 17 or Junior Miss that I care about? I subscribe to a variety of magazines. One is a general news magazine, and the rest have to do with woodworking. I'm far more interested in wood and equipment and toys than I am the issues of how can I win his heart and mind. Now you see, then that manifests itself even more. I'm a voyeur who loves to go shopping in a grocery store, and I love to read what is on the front page of these magazines that are there. Have you ever noticed, guys, that there's not an issue of popular mechanics there, but you can find out what J-Lo really thought? Every thought that J-Lo has ever had in her entire mind, and Ben, in my mind, you know what? I don't care. But it's obvious that a lot of people do, because you can find out a lot about J-Lo and Ben. You see, why are those magazines there? Because there's a market. What is the market called? Women. Who does most of the shopping in a grocery store? Even if the guy gets drug along, he's only there to carry stuff. Why? Because they won't let us buy all of the black olives that we want, all of the other things that we really love in the store. I go to the store with my wife and I'm like a little boy, can I have, I'm really good, can I have? My wife says, no, it's not. No, it's not good for you, or it's too expensive, or you can get that somewhere else. Oh. So I'm not there necessarily to shop as much as I am to carry and pay, right? I understand all of this. But you see what I'm getting at is then, why are those there? Because there are a large number of people, I guess, I understand that those are very popular magazines, that think, I just really need to read this afternoon. Oprah! How many of you tuned in to watch Oprah? Dr. Phil! All of this kind of thing. You see, it's out there. The world is a great cafeteria. And in an information-rich society, you have all of this stuff. And you can pick and choose, what do you want? What do you want to spend your time and your money for? And largely, you are driving that by selective exposure, selective retention, selective recall, etc., etc., etc. Even advertising. Some of you want to be in advertising. I will tell you that there are a lot of people. There was a famous guy who ran a big department store in New York City who said, I am convinced that half of the money that I spend on advertising is wasted. My problem is I never know which half. On a given day, how many ads are we exposed to? People actually tediously try to figure that out. I've seen variously 2,700 ads a day. How many of them do you really pay attention to? And if you said, well, not many of them, why do you pay attention to those that you do? Largely because something is being advertised that you are interested in one way or another. I like car ads. I really kind of get a kick out of those where you're out splashing around in mud and all of that kind of thing. I like the new Jeep ads. Not that I'm actually going to go out there and do that, but I imagine that my wife might let me. My wife is going to see this tape and kill me, isn't she? Well, to some extent it's true. I really want a sporty little car, and she thinks we ought to have another great big thing. Well, I don't know. There we go. I wanted a diesel truck. She let me buy a gasoline truck. It's all of this kind of stuff, isn't it? But selectivity becomes part of it. That's the whole argument of reinforcement theory. Relevant to that, uses and grats theory. We'll see that later on in larger detail. To what extent do you use the media as opposed to the media using you? To what extent do you use the media as opposed to the media using you? What do you think? Now, I think I'm supposed to have copies of Friends delivered to me that I can eventually put on for WebCT. Have I ever seen an episode of Friends? No. Why? Uses and gratification. They're not talking about anything that I'm interested in. I'm hoping that students like you are interested in that sort of thing. What does Friends talk about? Relationships? Romance? I'm well beyond that. I'm well beyond that. There's no romance in my life. I've got all the relationships that I can handle, etc., etc. The only reason I would watch Friends is so that I could understand something to talk over with you, right? And do they know that? Look at the advertising. Are they advertising things at Friends that they think I'm going to go buy? As a matter of fact, I am a demographic that people will spend almost no money trying to advertise to, because my purchasing behavior is so established by this time in my life. A number one with pickles, mustard, and onions. That's who I am. Dodge pickups. That's who I am, right? I've got it all nailed down. You had a comment.
You asked us how we use the media.
You bet.
You mentioned previously we use it for scripts.
Scripts. You use it for roles. You may use it for news. If anyone were to be getting married and wanted to have an outdoor wedding this weekend, would you be watching the weather reports? The rest of us think, well, it's likely to be pretty good. I don't have to pay a lot of attention to it. See what I'm getting at? We use the media. That's another reason why information richness becomes important to us, because we can have all of this sort of stuff. Some of you, And there are actual studies that are done with students like you, and they go out and they say, can we find out what radio stations you've got your car set to? Can we go out and look and see what you've got in your CD player? To what extent are there profiles within this room? And what do you bet that my radio is set to different radio stations than your car radio? And then you get into these fights with your significant other and or your parents, don't you? Why do you want to listen to that sort of stuff? Well, that's why we guys see as the only power base that we've got left in society at all is control over the remote control. We want to be in charge of selecting. We now even have movies, right, that are designed for date movies, guy movies. I've got a guy bunch up in the country. I think I mentioned this. We went to see The Italian Job this summer. There was an outing to go see Open Range. How many of you got together with friends to go see Open Range? You're not in that demographic, are you? You see what I'm getting at is that we use this, but should I have the opportunity to go see Open Range at the same time you're watching something that appeals to you? Again, that's the information richness, and it goes back to uses and gratifications. But it also suggests something, and that is that instead of just thinking of us as individuals who are written on by the media, we have to begin to realize that individuals with all of this richness then can pick and choose, and they can make or break us. Dependency theory. Dependency theory argues that the people in my life are as important or more important to me in the formation of my opinion or my entertainment choices than are the media themselves. One of the interesting questions that we deal with in understanding smoking initiation, meaning that young people start smoking. One of the realities is that most people, by the time they're 21, if they've never smoked a cigarette, are about as likely of being hit with a meteor as they are to start smoking. Most smoking behavior begins when people are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, something in there. And so one of the questions is, which is more influential over smoking initiation? Your friends, or watching smoking advertisements on television, or seeing them in the newspapers, magazines, or even billboards? Well, you don't see them anymore because they've been taken off. But back when they were. Are the people in our lives more predictive of what we see, how we see it, etc., than necessarily? How many of you have well-formed opinions of political candidates and their competence independent of what your friends think or your parents think or someone else, opinion leaders, as opposed to your own processing of the news? We know that one of the inheritances that we get from our family and our friends, working relationships as well, is our political preferences. So the argument is that when we think about media and the informativeness of media, a lot of times it has something to do with what the opinion leaders in our life have said or what we're expected to know to be a part of that group. And I mentioned to you the other day that if you are a sports buff, you get up and read the newspaper like homework. You watch the sports television programs and so forth as homework to make you conversationally competent. Because if you don't know that information, your friends will say, well, we don't want to talk to you anymore because you don't know what's going on. See what I'm getting at? It's interrelated, isn't it? Innovation theory. A number of years ago, a fellow was interested in the diffusion of innovations. How do innovations get started in a society? And I love to tell this story because I can remember it vividly myself. There is something called hybridized corn. You may never heard of it. Hybrid corn is corn that will not reproduce itself. But it is corn that is more likely to be productive to the farmer. But you have to buy the corn from the source that produces hybridized corn. And I could go into more detail about hybridization. than you would probably want. And there's a point at which I wouldn't know what I was talking about anymore, but I didn't know this context. Before that, farmers would keep a certain amount of seed corn from their own harvest, which they could take out and plant. Gave them a fair amount of control. Hybridized corn or hybrid corn comes in, the DeKalb Corn Company, and now they're introducing this as an innovation. What predicts how that innovation rolls itself out into society? They engaged in a marketing campaign, thinking that that campaign might be fairly linear. And they found out that in the first days, weeks, and months of that campaign, that only about 10% of the farmers took the risk of using Pioneer corn, and usually did so as a mix within other corn within their farm. And then slowly another 10% and another 10% and so forth. And one of the things that the Pioneer corn people did was then they realized, why not show up in town and give free corn for planting to the opinion leader farmers within a community. I can remember on a Sunday afternoon loading in the car, driving around, and my father would stop at a field that had the DeKalb corn signs up on the fence posts. He would get out and go look. He wanted to see for himself. He wanted to talk to the farmers. We were not an early adopter. We were a late adopter. Now, isn't that true of a lot of the same things that happen? How many of you bought a computer or got started with a computer or some other telecommunication device based upon the influence of people who had already adopted it, independent of an ad on television? The chances are very, very good that most of us use advertising of that sort to sort of consolidate an opinion, refine an opinion, rather than to inform or to initiate an opinion. That we see somebody else. We had a wealthy guy who was a real techno geek in our school years ago, and he was the first guy to go out and buy an Apple that came standard with 32K of memory, which for a considerable amount of money you could upgrade to a 64. My first computer was an old Apple, and the printer, and all of that cost me nearly $5,000, and I had a whopping 64K. I had 2 external drives. Whoa! And now, if I tried to sell that computer to you today, you would only pay for it as a relic, a book stop, doorstop, or for whatever parts you might be able to extract and sell somewhere else, right? We even know that. One of the things that we know is we buy a car, drive it out, it loses $3,000. We buy a computer, we load it in our car, it's already obsolete. Meaning that the innovation is going on at such a pace. The diffusion of innovations works largely through some interaction between interpersonal communication and mediated communication. Again, dependency theory says something about innovation theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, see, what I'm talking about here is I'm trying to put into context something that we'll talk about in greater detail later on, and it is that the notion of a dominant linear model of communication in mass media is much overblown. There are so many other factors that influence what we watch, what we read, what we listen to, when we listen to it, what we watch, etc., etc. And the argument increasingly is that because of all kinds of technologies, we have become increasingly the sovereign viewer. Because of the amount of media out there and the richness within the community, we are a sovereign viewer and reader. Over the last number of years, the major networks that used to have 100% of the televiewing market are now down to what, 70-some% or lower? I don't know what those figures are, but there's been a steady erosion of the amount of viewing of ABC, NBC, and CBS because there's alternative product, if we want to use that word. Yes, sir. Want to push the button?
What is innovation theory?
Innovation theory is that when a change is occurring in society, it does so through a combination of mass-mediated communication as well as interpersonal communication through opinion leaders. The opinion leaders are the early adopters. Their opinions, this is a good idea or a bad idea, can be enormously influential on whether the innovation occurs and the rate of the innovation adoption. We know that much the same sort of thing happens in terms of health communication campaigns. If I go into a village and I'm trying to convince people to do something differently, including getting inoculation, aren't there certain people that I have to convince first before I can attempt to convince anyone else? Often, for instance, inoculation is a decision that is made by the women in society. So who would be the most influential woman in the community, and if I can convince her, does that increase the likelihood that I can convince other people in the community? Do you see what I'm getting at? So that's how that theory has played out. The introduction of technical innovations, agricultural innovations, health innovations, and all of that sort of thing. Okay? And we'll see more about that later on. But I just wanted to preview some of that as we're going along. Now, the last term we come to is capacity. Capacity. Capacity can be looked at in a variety of ways. We can think of source capacity. Now, the easiest way to think about source capacity is if I'm trying to communicate with a lot of people, can I communicate better if I have a bigger newspaper? A bigger newspaper? Because I have greater source capacity. Is a big library with lots of books greater source capacity than a smaller library? Now you might say, well, what about specialty libraries? No problem, still the concept of source capacity. What is the capacity of the source to provide the information that I need? We talk about a witness. A witness who is a very good observer is a witness opposed to a witness that's a very bad observer. Some of you remember one of my favorite movies, My Cousin Vinny. Ever watch My Cousin Vinny? The woman who was looking out there to see, and she was looking through without her glasses or something like that. Is she a good witness? Source capacity, the capacity of knowing something. Do you turn into various news sources because of their capacity? Is CNN a different news source because of its capacity? CNN, FN News because of its capacity. Wall Street Journal because of its capacity. 17 because of its capacity. You see what I'm talking about? Capacity is the ability of the source to get throughput, process, and output information. Message capacity. Message capacity. If you're going into advertising and you're going to write a 30-second ad, what's the, quote, message capacity of a 30-second ad? Pretty limited. I challenged a class last night to imagine whose advertising you've probably seen more of in the last number of years than almost anyone else, and that's old Mattress Mac. Mattress Mac has, I think we figured last night, 5 message points. A message point is a point that he wants to get across. Where does he operate? Tidwell and Parker? That's beaten into your brain. He really will save you money. That ad came about because he was not making progress at being a furniture salesman. He was about to give up and go home. He hired an ad crew to work with him. He had no talent other than himself. He showed up, and finally one of the crew says, "What do you really want to tell people?" And he said, "Well, I think I can save them money." "You want to do what?" I really can save them money. And he had the day's take in his pocket. And he pulled it out and he said, "I can save them money." And there is how clever that ad was. So some of you that are in advertising say, well, maybe I just need somebody that's stressed, worn out, and got a pocket full of money, and I get my tagline. So he's going to save you money. He's going to deliver today, no back order slips, and it's solid wood. Unmarked trucks, if you want. If you're a yuppie, you can get it delivered in an unmarked truck. So you see what I'm getting at? All of the time that we've seen him What has he told us? Relatively little, but he tells us the same thing over and over and over and over and over again because these message points become very important. Message capacity. We even get into the notion of efficient writing. I'll bet that any of you that are being taught writing in the School of Communication have in one way or another the notion that the efficiency of your writing becomes important. How much news information can you get into the space available? Some of you go through a rather dramatic shift in mentality where you come out of the English department who has said, why don't you write a 1,000-word essay? And then you go into the journalism department or program and they say you have a 5-paragraph piece to write, which turns out to be a 5-sentence piece. The people in English, 5 sentences, you're not even into anything. And in journalism, 5 sentences and that's it. That's all you've got in the world. How can I get all this boiled out of 5 seconds? And that's efficiency, isn't it? How much information that's relevant to the telling of this story can I pack into that amount of space? That's the nature of source capacity translated into message capacity, isn't it? Now, we go further. What other capacity? Can we have channel capacity? Channel capacity. People typically say that print is capable of greater amounts of channel capacity than the electronic media. Ever heard of a guy by the name of Eric Severide? Ever heard of a guy by the name of, what was his buddy's name? I can't think. The other guy that was on CBS News? Cronkite. Oh, yes. Cronkite held up a newspaper one time and asked people if they knew a comparison of how much news there is in a newspaper to how much news there is in a 30-minute news broadcast, CBS National News in the evening. What would you say? The newspaper is one front page. If you started and read a front page of the newspaper, it would take you approximately 25 minutes, which is all the news that there is in a 30-minute news segment because you got to sell eggs and bacon and electricity and all the rest of that stuff. So a newspaper, if it's 40 pages long, and of course a 40-page newspaper is going to have 35 pages of advertising, but you see what I'm beginning to describe for you here is how that breaks down. Now again, one of the things that we like in terms of channel capacity is DSL speed. Oh my gosh. Just think how much information I can get so much faster with DSL. As though my whole life is dependent upon DSL. Fiber optics. Oh my gosh. My whole life is enriched because of fiber optics. Well, you see what we're getting at is there is an efficiency model in there as well, and channel design can be a big factor. And we know at a policy level, at a business plan level, that many companies, including pipeline companies, utility companies, built their entire business plan on the assumption that fiber optics was going to be a sort of infinitely needed resource. More fiber optic cable capabilities would increase your ability to make big money. What they didn't realize was that people could design information to go more quickly through the same amount of fiber optics. And I'm led to believe that about 85% of all the fiber optic capacity in the United States goes unutilized today. And there may be enough fiber optic capacity in the United States right now in place to solve all of our information flow problems. People have speculated into the year 3000. I don't know whether that's true or not. Well, you see what I'm getting about in capacity. How quickly you can get information from point A to point B. Finally, receiver capacity. Some of you feel real stressed in terms of receiver capacity. How quickly, how well can I get the information that's being presented to me? How I can process it as input, throughput, and output, and do well on an examination. If you're talking to somebody that's highly expert on a topic, they may have greater amount of receiver capacity than somebody that's not very knowledgeable. Their intellect can be a factor, can't it? Their experience, all of these kinds of things. The ability to receive and process information. We can also translate that into your computer. Back to channel capacity, it just occurred to me, you can often, when you dial into your ISP, find out how quickly your transmission is going to occur at that particular time, right? Somewhere between 24,000 and maybe upward to 50,000. That would be capacity in a channel form. Well, anyway, what we've tried to do is to package this stuff, getting you through information and persuasion, information and meaning. We've talked about the anatomy of the communication process. We've done so in a sense sort of going all the way back to our opening statement from Kenneth Burke that we are the symbol-using, symbol-misusing animal. Our entire identity, our ability to create society is dependent upon communication. The kind of society that we have, the kind of people that we are, can both be a reflection of what we have in the way of communication and how we go about communicating. We've introduced a variety of social scientific terms like variable theory, hypothesis, concept, that can help us to understand what we're doing. We've talked about a variety of meta-theories or meta-perspectives like scientific, covering law, rules, systems that help us to be able to understand some of the analytical threads that run throughout our study of what we're trying to understand during this semester. So with that sort of summary of where we've been and where we are, let me now open our remaining time to reviews, to answer questions, to clarify matters that you have, any of that sort of thing. Yes?
Is there anything that is on the test that's not on the review sheet?
Could be. Have no idea because I haven't made up the test yet. But I would not assume that there couldn't be something. One of the tricks that I have played in the past is to have 10 IDs off of the review sheet, maybe, and 2 that are not, which means that it reduces your choices if you only rely upon the review sheet, particularly if you don't even do all of the items on the review sheet. We have people that see class like the lottery. Okay? They're playing their odds. And so I try at various times to manipulate the odds so that I'm able to sort out the better, harder working, etc., from the others. But at the moment, I honestly don't know the answer to your question. But it wouldn't surprise me if I had, at least 7 or 8 off of the review sheet, 3 or 4 or 5 or so not on the review sheet. Okay? Yes, you bet.
Chapter 1, it talks about the 4 types of validity, and it says face validity.
Yeah, don't worry about beyond just the concept of validity. But face validity is if you look at something like I'm going to, and we'll talk about this when we get into, well, information is a good example. At face validity is what I'm measuring actually something that is information. Is it information? Is it attitude? Is it content? Is it channel? Is it like? Is it dislike? And so forth. Yeah.
So basically the test is ID and essay?
You bet. Just like the review sheet. There will be 3 essay questions. You write on 2, each of which you could earn up to 25 points for. 12, did I say ID? I meant essay. If I said ID, I meant essay. Did I say? Yeah. 3 essay. Okay. IDs, you're going to have 12 of them. Sometimes I'll run it up to 13 if I get to the point I can't really decide, but that works for you rather than against you. You will not get less than 12. Write on 10 for 5 points each.
As far as IDs, what do you mean by that?
Those are the little single words that are on the review sheet.
Right, but I mean as far as...
Definition. Definition could be answered in 1 line.
Oh, so we write down the definition.
You bet. You write down everything. All I provide is the question. There will be no true false, there will be no matching, no fill in the blank, none of that. Except that you've got a blank blue book, you get to fill in the blank. All right? Any other questions? And like I say, the review sheet gives you an idea how my evil mind works, what I think are the important terms. I try to highlight them as I go along. I try to package the material into an essay form as well. Some of you say, well, why do I have to learn all these terms? I would say that a vast amount of all disciplines is learning the terminology of the discipline. I had a daughter that was a biology major, and the hours that she spent just memorizing the name of stuff. Because knowing the name of stuff is a vital part of understanding a discipline. What are the terms that are relevant to understanding that discipline? And those are the terms that I single out as being the candidates as ID questions. And an ID question can be answered quickly in one sentence. I would also recommend that although the format of the exam is as I give it to you in the review sheet with the essay first and the ID following, if you want to do your 10 IDs first, be my guest. I would actually recommend that you do that, because there is no advantage to long, lingering analysis of an ID. You ought to be able to click, 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 get through that as quickly as possible, having the remaining time to write in a more leisureful way the answer to the essay questions. And you're quite welcome to do that. Yeah.
The word entropy is used in sort of a different way on pages 165 in mass-mediated communication.
I hope not, but maybe it's just not clear. Let's see if it's inconsistent versus not clear. Let's try and see what you think. What do you think entropy is, or how is it different between those two parts?
Well, I see it as either chaos or a tendency of the system to move towards
Chaos.
disorganization.
And there's even now a body of theory, which I won't introduce very much here, called chaos theory. But entropy is the principle that all things are going toward increased chaos, or going toward chaos, increased randomness. Now, it may be that you're talking about the part where we talk about the principle of entropy within a mass-mediated system. Part of that is that in an information-rich environment, I am more likely by random exposure to find information which I may find interesting and useful. You see how that begins to come back together? And so and we do that a lot, don't we? We're rummaging. We are scanners. When we read the newspaper, we a lot of times scan, don't we? We listen to conversations and say, should I know more about that? Meaning that we encounter a lot of stuff in a fairly random way. And then, and it's interesting even in that regard, some of the most important news events of our life we actually encounter, first of all, in conversation. And I mentioned in here the other day the shooting of John Kennedy, and we learned about it through conversation, and then we went to the media to find out what the media would tell us about that. And the media are even beginning to produce random glimpses based upon the random individuals that are randomly interviewed and randomly available and so forth. You see what I'm getting at? So there is that, but news gathering tries to bring order to a random environment, and then we go in a random environment and maybe use the media to reduce the randomness of that environment. Does that help to pull all of that together? Yes, sir.
Your essays, how many pages do you
Oh, 30 or 40, I would say, would probably be enough. You get any beyond that, and we'll figure that you knew way too much and already just admit you to graduate school. Now, it's hard to say. What I typically do at the beginning of the examination is to say, write as fully as you can. And I said in here the other day that in my mind, you don't get any extra credit for the first person out of the door. So there's no real incentive to be the first person out. Stay, spend your time, think, don't hurry, don't rush, utilize your time. But by the same token, I know that there are people that can write 40 pages of virtual nonsense. And there are other people that can write 4 pages of really good stuff. And the 4 pages will get more points than the 30 pages. And I've had people come to me and say, look at this, my friend got an A and she wrote 3 pages and I wrote 35 pages and I got a C. I don't get it. Then I begin to go through and say, well, did you talk about this? Well, no. Did you talk about this? Well, no. Did you talk about this? Well, no. Then I'm saying, well, in your 30 pages, what you wrote didn't really tell me that you knew what I wanted you to know. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it isn't just length, but by the same token, I don't want to give anyone that sort of false incentive that somehow I write down so-and-so was the first person out of class, so they must be the brightest, et cetera, et cetera. I've actually had people hand in the exam early. I sometimes go over and look at it, and I find 3 IDs answered in half of one essay. And I say that in part because some of you sitting there saying, well, how could that person be done so quickly? Done is a relative concept, isn't it? Done may mean overcooked, baked, burned up, thrown out, discarded, as opposed to you sitting there patiently writing a lot of good stuff. And I say that because a kind of contagion effect can set in, saying, here I am lingering, I must be the dumbest person in here. So don't think that. The first person out may be very bright, an enormous amount of capacity, got it all done, and did it in a very efficient way. But the first person may also, right, I've seen this happen. I've had people hand it in and say, sorry, I've done badly. I thought I wouldn't have to study as much as you were expecting me to. I didn't recognize anything on this. Please forgive me. Can I arrange another examination? And I say to them, yes, in another semester under other circumstances, because this was your moment. This is the Olympics. At the Olympics, if you weren't on the bus and you didn't get to the venue, you don't get to compete, right? And the same thing is true here. Any other questions? Yes.
What do you mean by, talking about the relationship between the variables? What do you mean when you said that the curvilinear is the relationship between 2 variables being U-shaped?
It means that a variable may be either more or less important at the midpoint in the curve. And that's hard for you to understand. And so for that reason, I'm very unlikely to put curvilinear relationship on your exam, which then tells a lot of other people they don't have to listen to anything that I say for the next couple of minutes. But when we get into the chapter on persuasion, what we'll find is that fear appeals operates in a curvilinear relationship. That a minimum amount of fear appeal doesn't arouse us enough to pay attention. A high degree of fear appeals may become so threatening that we just go into denial. So if we can figure out the moderate degree of fear appeals, it's the one to arouse enough interest, curiosity, problem recognition that we then become open to a message. We use that concept a lot in health communication, where we try to communicate to people that they need to know something because they should have fear, anxiety, concern, because something relates to their interest or something relates to the interest of somebody that they care about, like their children or their parents or someone like that. So moderate would be where the highest amount of influence was, so there would be a curvilinear as opposed to a linear relationship, is where you run up the axis like that, from low to high, or a negative where you go high to low, all right? And it's hard for us to scale those things, but gives you at least an idea of how we go about thinking. Yes?
I have a definition for referent.
All right.
I'm happy with it.
Well, that's okay. You try your definition of referent, which refers to the triangle of meaning, right? Oh, she says that's what it refers to. She's writing in her notes here. I didn't make that connection. The triangle of meaning is where we talk about referent. And that's the basis of referential in the word referential theory. So tell me what you think a referent is.
I have what a word means.
I think that's a little vague. 5 points, maybe we'd give you 1. Maybe we'd give you 2. Depends on whether we're, refreshed and happy or whether we're grumpy. The triangle of meaning argues, and this is Ogden's theory, Ogden and Richards and Ogden, that there are 3 components to meaning. One is the reference, one is the referent, the thing, the thought, and the symbol, right? The thing, the thought, and the symbol. The referent is the reality. The referent is a reality. If I want you to know what hot means, I might say the stove is hot, and if you touch the stove, you've had contact with that. The symbol is the word, the squiggles, the sounds, hot, and the reference is the residual of that experience. And that's how meaning comes to be acquired and then ultimately shared and utilized within a society, because we know that people in a language society have a similar triangle of meaning. Is that correct? Then we carry it the next step into linguistic relativity and suggests that the symbol and the meaning associated with a symbol may define reality more than reality defining the symbol. Good example, hot now can translate into peppers. I'm not a person that likes really hot peppers, but we know that some people say, the hotter the better. You can't get a pepper too hot for me. So hot is a relative concept, isn't it? Yeah. But we only know hot peppers by trying them, and that's why parents of children sometimes like to feed their children all of this kind of stuff to watch their reaction. Hey, give the kid a pepper, see how the kid reacts. Okay? Any other questions? I'm in no hurry. We've got people fleeing by the thousands here, but I'm in no hurry. Any other questions? Yes? I didn't hear what you said. I have no idea, because I haven't even thought about the essays as I put them together. It would also depend upon how I would configure it. For instance, there's a question on the review sheet that has 3 theories of meaning. And I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out what the value of you knowing that is. We haven't worried, that there are 27 theories. Are you going to have to know all 27? I mean, I have no idea. You asked me a question that nobody's ever asked, and my answer is probably inadequate. But I have no idea, and I don't know why that would be relevant, because it's not like we've got this laundry list of theories and we're hoping that you would know 27 out of 34 of them. Try me again if I didn't get it. Well, or did I get your question? Okay. There are 2 theories of information. There are 3 theories of meaning, and I would say at this point that's about all the real theories of theories that we've talked about. But today we talked about what? About 5 theories of mass media. We talked about a couple of the theories of interpersonal, at least one of them a bit. So, but at this point, the only theories as theories that I would really hold you accountable for are the 3 theories of meaning, and I would say the 2 theories of information, the fixed and the media impact, or the information receiver impact model or theory, where the difference is whether you are able to make a decision based upon there being a fixed number of information bits within a decision, like a card deck, 52 cards. The worst that we can do is to make 51 guesses to guess which card was selected. If we max it, we can get it all in one. The chances of that are not great. But we can go through a system and get it routinely within 5 or 6. You see what I'm getting? Why can we do that? Because it's a fixed decision, a defined set of bits. The other one is the informativeness of any message is the difference that we experience in our own mind of being more or less uncertain for having got the message, interpreted it, etc., meaning it's the receiver impact. And it's a subjective dimension, but we do a lot of that in life, don't we? We do a lot of that in life, yes. Well, there are 3 theories of meaning, and those 3 theories are the referential, right? And I think that that's exactly one of the review questions. There's a referential theory. There is a linguistic relativity theory. That's Kenneth Burke and those bunch. And then the other one is the, what do we want to call it? I think we call it constitutive purposive. It's the meaning and action, the ordinary communication.
And then 2 theories of
And 2 theories of information.
where is, I'm
sorry, where's that here? Two theories?
The two theories in the review sheet? I don't know, is it or is it not? It certainly is in the book and was in our discussion. Do I not mention it here? Well, I talk about two approaches. People seek information to reduce uncertainty. This is item 5. Information can be defined as data in a decision model, fixed decision. Another definition features the impact each piece of data has on each person's sense of uncertainty. Is that what we're talking about? Compare the two approaches. There are people that make a good living trying to translate what we would call subjective information or probabilistic information into binary decision modes. A lot of computer design is predicated upon that because computers can only think in binary ways. And you have decision trees. Some of you are in MIS. No one in here in MIS and so forth. But you begin to think in terms of decision trees. And decision trees are often driven by the ability to take information and translate it into this sort of set of trees. Medical diagnosis seeks to go in that way. Part of medical diagnosis is to eliminate certain alternatives in a diagnosis. And I've heard that it's more likely to eliminate alternative explanations than it is to confirm a single explanation. Is that fair? Or any of you sons and daughters, any physicians in here? I'm just teasing. Why would you be in here if you were a physician, right? But they look at you and they say, well, there could be 30 things wrong with you. Let's run a series of tests to see which of the hypotheses, what's wrong with this person, is the most likely to be true. Isn't that the way it goes? It's an elimination of possibilities. That's at least how it's been explained to be my family-friendly family physician. Other questions? I so love reviews that I'm in no hurry ever to end them as long as I think you're at least relatively tolerant, concerned, no uncertainty at all. Yes, go ahead.
Today you talked about policy, and you said that there were two.
One was the organizational policy. If we're in a news gathering organization, our policy can influence what we do and what we say, how we go about it, what do we think of as real news, and so forth and so forth. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to sit on a plane coming from Washington, D.C. to Houston with a young woman who was at a fairly high level in the WashingtonPost.com. It was their online newspaper. And she said, whereas other newspapers went online just merely taking the print version and putting it online, what we tried to do is to do the WashingtonPost.com as an online database that people could use to get information to explore more deeply. I would argue that that really gets at that business of policy, how we're going to provide information. What is information? Corporate public affairs, public relations policy can go in that same direction. The other one is the larger policy within society. And one of the questions we have is, to what extent can various media merge so that it limits the number of outlets that we might have, because through merger we may eliminate alternative sources of information. Yeah.
Is that social policy, governmental policy? How would you?
I would say it's some mix of that. Sometimes it's surely the size of the market. I had a rather startling realization when I got to New Zealand. The entire country of New Zealand has a population the same as Houston. They have 2.5, as I recall, channels, because one of the channels wasn't on all the time. And of all of the channels that were there, most of the programming was from Australia, United States, and England, except for rugby and soccer and what was the other thing? And then some local news. But they had very little entertainment programming. It was because they didn't have a big enough market to sustain the stuff that would fill that period of time, because it cost production costs and so forth. It really bothered them to have American programming and Australian programming, because they really, down there, would much rather think of them as a British colony than having anything to do with the inferior cultural parts of the world, most particularly the people across that little body of water over there called Australia. There's a real friction between those folks. The only time that they agree is in their hatred of Britain for what was perpetrated against Anzac, which was the New Zealand Australia Army Corps. They were literally used as cannon fodder. Well, anyway, I think that part of it is that it is the societal interest. What can we as a society sustain, maintain, and utilize? What do we want? But that often can be driven into policy, and then the desires of the people may or may not be frustrated by how policy gets worked out. I think, for instance, that we can have too many mergers. I think we can have the possibility that simply through the limiting, I like cable, I like satellite, I like all of the kinds of communication channels. I like the fact that you go to a Borders books and you can see 75, 100, 200, 300, whatever it is, magazines, because I think that ultimately it's that richness. But it's some combination between policy. We know, for instance, that there are various religious organizations in a society that think we've got too much richness, and they want to eliminate. When I was in Berlin a summer ago, I had a chance to stand, and it was really sort of stunning, in the square across the street from, is it Humboldt University in Berlin, where the book burnings took place, where they literally emptied the entire library of Humboldt University and burned it in that square. Am I close to getting it right? Yeah. That was really stunning to me. I mean, I stood there imagining what it would be like to be a faculty member at Humboldt University and watch your entire library going up, because what was in that library could be alternative thoughts which the Nazi regime simply would not allow people to have access to. So that's the kind of policy decisions that we get into. And that to me is why the First Amendment is important. Not so much that somebody then can talk about something, because I as an individual have the privilege, the right, perhaps the responsibility to know as much as I possibly can. Yeah? Did you want to say something? You look like you were, no?
I have a small question in regard to the examples you said when we were writing examples of the test, we might hurt ourselves.
No, I would say that more in terms of the IDs, not in terms of the essays. If you want to use your examples, I would use them in the essays.
Like when you apply a theory and then we want to...
I think that's wonderful. One of the reasons I try to tell relevant and maybe even interesting stories is to help you to understand something by being able to remember the illustration or the story. But what I was saying is that in an ID, if you go into a long, detailed description or story with an ID, that can be inefficient. If you can't think of anything else, write a story down, and we'll see if we can figure out that you know something, right? But I wouldn't get into, I've seen people write full pages on IDs. And one of the problems with an ID is that sometimes the more you write, the more trouble you get.
Less time you have for this.
And then the less time you have for the essay, all right? Is that it?
Basically, we put answers in the IDs in
One
one sentence.
sentence. One sentence.
Any examples for the essay?
I would say that's one of the best places to use your examples. Yeah, all right. Well, I enjoyed working through the first part. Look forward to seeing whether I made any success with you or not.